Welcome to Small Talk with the Lees. I'm your host, Brandon Lee, and co-host Justin Lee, and we're joined by Alejandro and Andre. And we're four Mormons discussing the topics in the CES letter, or in this case, a topic that's not discussed in the CES letter, but could be the smoking gun. So we're going to talk about Deutero-Isaiah, which is basically the problem of an anachronism that Isaiah isn't actually written by Isaiah, yet it's quoted in the Book of Mormon many times when Lehi couldn't possibly have known about it if it's true that it wasn't written by Isaiah. And so we're going to get into very technical details here. I'm actually recording this after we just finished our recording. And so it's like a 3-hour session. I'm going to say I think the 3 hours was necessary to really understand the arguments here and flesh them out from both the apologetic side and the argumentative side. And it's not a debate just in Mormonism, but it's actually one that's debated between evangelicals and liberal Christians. So the problem of Deutero-Isaiah is not one unique to Mormonism. That being said, we provide some ways to analyze this as a faithful Mormon, and also to do it in an intellectually honest way, such as the examples of Abraham Gileadi, B.H. Roberts, and Grant Hardy. So we discuss their views as well as other views presented by David Bokovoy and other biblical scholars. And you're going to get a really comprehensive outlook and understanding of these issues. If you want to look into the specific details of them, the PowerPoint is going to be posted in some form, maybe a Google Doc, with the podcast description. And you can look at the specific scripture verses and look them up on your own time. So that being said, you're in for a treat. The first part's going to be an introduction to the Deutero-Isaiah problem, and the second part will be an entire systematic outlook at the main arguments for and against multiple authorship of the Book of Isaiah. All right, welcome back to Small Talk with the Lees. This is part 11 of our CES letter discussion, and today we're going to focus on one of the biggest anachronisms probably in my view of the Book of Mormon, and that's the Deutero-Isaiah problem. So the CS letter doesn't actually talk about this specific issue. And I think that's one of the actual weaknesses of the CS letter, because I think this is one of the strongest arguments against the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Yet the CS letter doesn't mention it.
It's also really technical. So the author of the CS letter isn't like running at the highest speed yet. So that's probably why he couldn't include it.
Or probably didn't want to. He probably would have confused listeners.
That's actually, I think that's more accurate, is that the nature of the CS letter is it has to hit you like a salesman hits you, you know? It right. Reads like a really interesting book. If you throw the Deutero-Isaiah problem, you can't even pronounce that word, Deutero-Isaiah. So
you get lost.
So yeah.
I guess he could have just put multiple Isaiah authorship.
Yeah, like I said, he's not running that fast. Like, he's doing the best he can.
So let's just describe this. I want to give some background to this problem. And this is basically a problem that not just LDS members face, but actually evangelicals face. And this whole issue stems from something called biblical studies, which is kind of like the scholarly study of the Bible, the academic setting of it. And this biblical studies has been met with a lot of resistance from the evangelical types, that includes LDS members and the church. And so I kind of just want to start with this quote by Greg Prince, who we talked about is a defender of the faith, of the LDS faith. And he kind of points out that we need to stop criticizing the tool of biblical studies. And instead, once we accept it, then we can actually start from a whole new position, a stronger foundation. So I'll just read the quote. He says, if you look at the history of biblical studies, you'll see that the initial years of higher criticism a century ago sent shockwaves through religious communities, particularly the fundamentalist ones whose houses were built on sandy foundations of scriptural literalism and inerrancy. Instead, what happened and continues to happen, thanks to biblical scholarship, is that the Bible is in a far stronger position than it was prior to higher criticism. Once my co-religionists who are defending their hill are able to make one paradigm shift, they will find the doors flung wide open to a deeper appreciation appreciation of what the Book of Mormon really is. And I think this is a different quote, but there's another quote where he basically said, once we accept the foundation of biblical studies or higher criticism, we can jump to the higher planes of a more, I don't remember what he said, but a more honest interpretation and analysis and an application of scriptural texts, including the Book of Mormon. So I just want to point out here, the word criticism here is not someone who's attacking the Bible. What it is actually trying to say is criticism is a very scholarly word in that you're analyzing the text from a critical or objective point of view in the historical context.
Yeah, I think that has to do with everything. You know, we look for truth, right? Isn't that what it's all about? And you kind of want to look for it wherever it's found. And I think even Brigham Young talked about that. He said, you know, wherever truth is, we claim it. You know, and that's what we want to find.
Yeah, that's a common theme of Joseph Smith too. One of my favorite quotes is something like where he says that we look for truth wherever it may come from. Right? And he was talking about even the Protestants, even the Presbyterians.
Yeah.
He didn't mention the atheists but I would assume, you know.
We can include them. We can include
Yeah.
them.
And I think just like a quick, by the way, the many different episodes that we've done on the CES letter has zoomed in, and some people have even messaged me and told me they think it zoomed in unnecessarily deep into the weeds where we lose sight of things and it causes listeners to lose sight of things that are actually important in the church. And I guess to that, I would just respond, I think we're doing the best we can. I think there is a lot of value in looking at these podcast episodes in aggregate and kind of seeing how together there's kind of a common theme that's running through this is what we want to do. I mean, maybe speaking for myself, but maybe the others as well, is provide a systematic approach, a framework that allows for faithful holding to the church, but also not being too, I guess, literal or holding to a historical interpretation. It's not necessarily that we rest our testimonies on the historical infallibility of the church, but rather there's many other aspects that are more important. We think that we can do this. And I think zooming in a lot on these issues starts to show how many rabbit holes there are, how many nuanced issues there are, and you could dig into these things for years, and academics do this all the time, but it comes to a point where you're like, well, I don't even know how much more I can go into this because there's so much stuff. But I think that kind of shows that how difficult some of those historical problems are, and that's not necessarily where the religious value lies with the doctrines and the teachings that our church espouses.
I've kind of thought of this podcast as like my own Descartes meditations. So I walk you through kind of my thought process of how I'm systematically interpreting Mormonism from this religious framework, right? Because I think there's that false dichotomy of science versus religion, or biblical studies versus a faithful scholar, right? That you can't be both. And I've had people respond a lot of that Book of Mormon episode that we posted, you know, and I asked the question, can you find value in the Book of Mormon if you dismiss the historicity or that it is an ancient record? And, you know, I got a lot of different interesting responses. One of them is particularly interesting, and it was by Jared Anderson. And he talked about how he's a biblical scholar, by the way, and he's of the LDS tradition. He studied under Bart Ehrman, who's an atheist now. And he actually said that, you know, I think the strongest framework to do this in is not to analyze it that it's either historical or not historical, but rather to focus on the value and then allow for the historicity, but rather than dismiss it. And so I think that's kind of a good point that he made, that when we're trying to address all sorts of audiences, right, from the person that stumbles upon the CS letter, or the biblical scholars, or the Mormon studies people that are looking in on this, right? And we're trying to address all sorts of these audiences, that we are able to show that we can communicate with each side and find some type of common ground. And I think that common ground is going to be that there is value that you could pull out from this. And it's not just a little bit of value, it's an entire framework that frames your morality your behavior and the way that you direct your lives. And so that's where I really find the value of religion. And I'm coming from that angle, whereas opposed to maybe others talking about the CS letter going to either dismiss it because they're so set on this, on what they've grown up with learning and how they've seen religion this entire time. And also versus the other people on the other hand, who are just so easy to dismiss religion and Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith because they're just reading the Book of Mormon in order to dismiss it.
Yeah. And
Dude,
Brian,
I think,
oh, go for it.
sorry, I think a big part of it, you know, is what we were talking about before, like this idea of like looking at things kind of with an open mind and really not trying to reduce them, really trying to open us up to like the complexity of things. Like I always think of this story when it comes to like traditions and things like that. Like for example, I was told this a couple of years ago, but like someone's mom was teaching them how to cook fish. And so they cut the head of the fish off and then they put it in the frying pan and cook the fish. And so then the daughter asked the mom, she's like, how come you cut the head off of the fish? And she's like, oh, that's how the recipe goes. Well, who taught you the recipe? My mom. So then, you know, the mom asked her mom, how come you cut the head off the fish? And she's like, oh, that's how my mom taught me how to do it. And then she asked the grandma. The grandma says, I just didn't have a frying pan big enough for the fish. So she cut the head off. Right. And so you look back on these things and like we're discovering the purity within the gospel. You know, some things are carried through tradition. Some things you just hear and repeat and things like that. And so you're, you know, when it comes to Bible studies and things like that, you're looking at the history of things and not and taking away like the traditions that have been passed down that maybe aren't the purity of like the gospel, aren't the purity of what the message is trying to communicate. And so there's no badness in looking back and saying, hey, this is what we find, especially what we're going to do now with Isaiah, right? This is what we find. Let's see, what's the other message? What's the other thing we can learn about it?
So I just want to sum up what you said there with one quote. I think his name, Patrick Mason, I believe. He's the head of Mormon studies at UVU, or sorry, not UVU. The one up by Logan. USU, yeah. He said, we put too much truth into our truth cart, and what we have to do now is empty that truth out that is unnecessary, right? So what we're trying to do is get to the real, let's say, value that is in the gospel or in the church or in the scriptures. And specifically, this problem of the Deutero-Isaiah problem points out a really huge problem for those who want to focus on the historicity of it. And I think, you know, this presentation is not going to make you decide one way or the other. Of course, I have my strong opinions about this, but I'm going to try to do my best to present both the apologetic responses and the responses to the responses and kind of how this whole discussion has been playing out in not just the LDS field, but also the evangelical versus the liberal Christians field. So,
I just wanted to add one more thing is, I know that there are people who have complained about how we zoom in, but it's important that we do so because when you adopt a frame, the downside is that you can fall into confirmation bias, and so examining these things helps you it helps you be less susceptible to that, and also when you come across these things, it's not so shocking because everything that it's unknown or that's novel to you will shock you to a degree. And so we're trying to play both sides and like adopt a framework, but then also explore like what the criticisms are so that we can overcome our personal biases, but then also gain an insight into what our LDS tradition holds.
Yeah, dude, there's something to be said there. You never want to dismiss faith, right? Because you know, with confirmation bias, there's this like inclination of wanting things to be real, right? Wanting things to be the way that you think they are. And that's not a bad thing. Not all the time. Sometimes it is, but not all the time. Because like, you know, Jordan Peterson kind of talks about this too. He's like, you can't know everything, right? And because you can't know everything, some things you just have to assume or believe, right? And so, you know, so when we're looking at these topics and things like that, it's just more power to you to know more about it, know more about like the things that are being studied, the things that are true and historical, and then you can go from there. But there's, as we've talked about in the church, like there's no goodness in ignorance, right? The more you know about something, the more you can go based off that, right?
And
But
I think the greatest example of that in our tradition, LDS tradition, is B.H. Roberts, right? Because he wrote the studies on the Book of Mormon or whatever, and he pointed out all of the strongest arguments you could find against his own faith. That's called still manning. And then he responded to all of them, all the ones that he could, right? And we're actually going to show what his view, 100 years back, he actually dealt with this problem of Deutero-Isaiah, and I'm going to show you what his responses were. Of course, they're outdated. They don't deal with the latest information in biblical studies, but they're there. And I think that's a role model to follow of an intellectual who was also an apostle of the LDS Church. So let's just jump in if there's no other further comments.
do it.
Okay, so this Deutero-Isaiah problem, I think to really outline what the problem is, people familiar with the Book of Mormon will know this kind of timeline, okay? And so we know that around 740 is when Isaiah was a prophet. Isaiah died around the 698 BC. And then Lehi and his family, so the Book of Mormon talks about this family named Lehi and Nephi, and Lehi's the father, Nephi's the son, and they actually escaped Jerusalem around 600 BC. Okay, so that date is key, right? So it's either 600 or 597 or 593, but in general consensus, Lehi leaves Jerusalem about 600 years before Christ. Okay, now that's not actually important specifically what year Lehi leaves, as long as that Lehi leaves Jerusalem before it's destroyed. Because what happens later is we know Jerusalem actually falls to the Babylonians. And that happens in 588 BC. So about 10 years after Lehi leaves. And it's not until 50 years later, 538 BC here, where Cyrus, king of Persia, actually defeats the Babylonians, and he lets the Jews return out of Babylonian captivity back to Jerusalem. Okay, so there's a whole lot of dates there, and hopefully listing it out here helps. But the key issue of the Deutero-Isaiah problem is, those of you familiar with the Book of Mormon text know that Lehi went back, got the plates, and those plates had the writings of Isaiah on them, so they claim. And Lehi took those plates before the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, and then they traveled to the Americas. Now, the Book of Mormon quotes Isaiah all throughout. It quotes all sorts of chapters from Isaiah extensively, probably the most quoted biblical book in the Hebrew Bible that is in the Book of Mormon. Now, the issue here comes when suddenly biblical scholarship is identifying this book of Isaiah not as written by a single author, Isaiah, but rather it's composed of multiple authors, and they split it into three main parts: Proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. So that's this slide.
Just first, second, and third.
First Isaiah, second Isaiah, and third Isaiah, exactly. And so the book of Isaiah is split into 66 chapters nowadays. And so they put the first 30 chapters as first Isaiah, the next 16 chapters as second Isaiah, and then the remaining 11 chapters as third Isaiah. Okay, so what happens is the real issue of anachronism of the Book of Mormon comes when we look at Deutero-Isaiah, and the biblical scholars have
Would you
dated
please
this.
define anachronism?
Yeah, sure. Anachronism is something that is out of historical context. So like if people are talking about Christians in, let's say, 2000 BC, that's probably an anachronistic word, right?
Mm-hmm. If you refer to someone as a Christian in 2000 BC, gotcha.
It
Right.
like doesn't fit. It's historically
Doesn't fit the timeline. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, like someone in the 1800s mentioned, "Oh yeah, well I can't wait to go home and use the internet," or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
doesn't make sense, right? There's no way it was written in 1800.
Yeah, if your boomer grandma says that she was a TikToker back in the 60s, you know that's anachronistic. It couldn't have happened. And so the anachronism problem here that the CS letter doesn't mention, but I think is the strongest example of anachronism, is that Deutero-Isaiah is dated at a later date, about 530-ish post-exilic, which means the exile is when the Jews left Jerusalem to Babylonia because they were slaves. And then post-exilic means after they return, pretty much, when Cyrus of Persia let them back.
So,
Okay.
Brandon, just to clarify for the listeners, so then
Yeah.
Lehi getting the plates before Jerusalem's destroyed, that means there shouldn't be any Deutero-Isaiah in there, right? Second Isaiah.
Exactly.
But then what we do see in there is that he's quoting from Second Isaiah. So that's where the anachronism is. How is he able to quote from Second Isaiah when that shouldn't exist when he stole it? Because based on that, not stole, but when they took it from Jerusalem, it doesn't fit in that timeline. So that's
right.
how
You
I
should
my
be
question
the editor of the CS letter, Justin, because you just worded it exactly how Jeremy Reynolds would have worded it.
So
But-
what evidence do they have that it was written by different people?
Right. So we're going to get into the multiple authorship versus single authorship debate here. But I just want to point out real quick before we go into that, we're not going to go into the technicalities of these specific verses, but they're here for the reader or the observer, the listener, to explore on their own. You know, this can be your next come follow me study. So here we have the Book of Mormon verse, right? Let's say 1 Nephi 21, verses 14 through 21. And it quotes from Isaiah 49, 14 through 21. As you can see, Isaiah 49 is in the Deutero-Isaiah portion, which is dated as to material that would have been written after Lehi left Jerusalem. So it's weird that he would be able to have access to that. Okay, and the red here is specifically problematic verses. These are the most problematic ones. I think they use, it's been a while since I've read these, but I believe they use words like desolation or like destruction, okay, which would be referring
And
to the exilic.
just briefly, Andre, they analyze a lot of like the use of historical figures or like certain words and stuff that would have been used in times, and then they kind of determine it based on that. But I think
Right. So biblical studies is looking
The
at
possible
the
records.
text,
That
at
makes
the
sense.
sources, at the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's say. They're going to look at everything we have. They're going to look at the content in it. They're going to look for patterns of breaks, let's say, different styles of uses of word, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So not only is Deutero-Isaiah a problem, though. So Fairs actually tries to address this Deutero-Isaiah problem. And we're going to talk a little bit about their arguments. There's other problems, though. So Proto-Isaiah, chapters 1 through 30, that is actually not all written before Lehi left, actually. So there's a lot of arguments that Isaiah 2 through 14 all actually have later redactions and edits. And some of them were actually written later, not just edited later. So there's a lot of evidence for that. So that's
So
problematic.
I have a question. Why would they all be compiled in the same book? Why wouldn't they be changed to different books? Why would they all be kept under Isaiah's book?
Yeah.
So
What?
yeah, so when I was studying this, one scholar, Abraham Galeati, I think is his name, he makes the argument for why it's a unity, and then he also makes arguments for why it was all unified in one book, and we can touch that later. But he makes a literary case for that. So good question. It's going to take some unpacking to get there, though. When we'll get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good surface value argument in favor of single authorship, right? At its face. Well, it comes in one book for us. Okay. So we'll get into that and the Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit. I want to point out an even thornier problem. So Trito-Isaiah is certainly dated, almost certainly dated. I guess Abraham Gileadi wouldn't agree with that. But almost all the biblical scholars would say certainly Trito-Isaiah is way later. And Fair would go so far to say as, luckily, we don't have Trito-Isaiah in our Book of Mormon. Okay. And David Bokovoy and Brent Metcalf and Colby Townsend, 3 biblical scholars in Mormon studies. Sorry, Brent Metcalf's not a biblical scholar. But 3 Mormon studies people have pointed out that even though there's not explicit quotations of Trito-Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, there are references to Trito-Isaiah that are contained in the Book of Mormon.
So is there a consensus that there are 3 different, like that first, second, third part of Isaiah? That's a consensus.
It's a consensus among biblical scholars, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and not only that, it's also one of the longest standing consensus. And so, within biblical scholarship.
What do you mean by long?
So,
like since early?
Yeah, well, or yeah, so yeah, it's kind of confusing. So I guess the lay reader, the average reader of the book of the Bible will say, "Oh, well, yeah, of course, Isaiah is one book, one author." But then, as biblical studies as a field, they discovered relatively early that it's had multiple authors,
Oh, right. Uh-huh.
and we've known that for a really long. Like that idea has been thrown around for like a really long time, and so arguments about it being a unified, like legit arguments of it being a unified work are relatively new compared to the arguments that there are multiple authors. So it's a consensus.
What do you mean
and,
legit, as in the ones that actually seriously take into consideration the arguments that have been made in favor of multiple?
like articulating like rational argumentation that it's a unified work are relatively like newer.
Okay, so I have another question. So Isaiah is said to be a prophet during this time of Jerusalem, right? And so who are the other guys, right?
Right. So okay. So you're making a lot of points that B.H. Roberts is making. So I'm going to go straight to that. Okay, and we're going to discuss these arguments. So B.H. Roberts, LDS scholar and apostle and intellectual, he sums up this whole problem in one perfect paragraph. I think he just words it perfectly. The difficulty presented by the higher criticism is obvious, viz. If Joseph Smith is representing the first Nephi as transcribing into his Nephite records passages and whole chapters purporting to have been written by Isaiah, when as a matter of fact, those chapters were not written until 125 or 150 years after Isaiah's death, and not until 50 years after Lehi's colony has departed from Jerusalem, then Joseph Smith is representing Nephi as doing that which is impossible and throws the whole Book of Mormon under suspicion of being fraudulent. This, therefore, becomes a very interesting as well as a very important objection, and many among the higher critics will say a fatal one. Here it can only be treated in outline. It is undoubtedly worthy of exhaustive analysis. So I just want to point out that B.H. Roberts, LDS faithful member till his death, is saying this is a serious problem that we have to deal with. And that was 100 years ago, right? Now it's only gotten more serious because of the weight of the biblical scholarship underneath the evidence here. I'm going to go on to the next slide. These are his arguments. And so B.H. Roberts is a defender of the unitary Isaiah, which means the book of Isaiah is written by Isaiah. Duh. Okay. And so here's kind of his arguments back in the 20th century and how he dealt with it, because he understood the problem pretty well based on the arguments that were presented at the time. Okay. And this is all linked in the bibliography, so you can go and look at what he said specifically. But here's what he said. Okay, his main points was that, first of all, we have, as LDS members, we have the Book of Mormon as evidence. That's the strongest evidence that Isaiah is written by Isaiah and no one else. Okay, so he says, after the overwhelming evidences for the truth of the Book of Mormon are taken into account. So David Bokovoy pointed out, though, that this is one of his least favorite arguments because what is that? What? Yeah.
It's like circular reasoning.
Right, because the question here isn't about Isaiah. The question here that we're examining is the Book of Mormon, let's say, a fraud or not, or is it historical or not? Right? And so we can't use
the Book
it
of Mormon
as
to
evidence.
defend the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. So, but this is something that gets thrown around a lot. And, if you go to BYU or let's say you're in CES, this is probably what's going to be stated as the main evidence is, you don't have to believe in a multiple authorship because we have the Book of Mormon to show that it's not. Right. So this is going to be a hard one for a lot of people to not accept as credible, I guess.
But yeah, I think that's that's an easier response for seminary teachers or institute teachers to make because it resonates with most people that have grown up with these types of arguments of historicity, I think. So it helps them not have to dive into it. I think that's why they would want to use it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of avoiding the question of, is the Book of Mormon historical or not, right? Because maybe that's not even the question. So
right.
So that's not the question here. So I think that's a bad argument. Let's go to the next one. Isaiah is a literary genius. So B.H. Roberts is arguing that Isaiah is a literary genius. So he's able to write in different styles, a wide range of literary style. He says the largest richness in coloring and forms of expression. Okay, so that's kind of an assertion. So we can get into that more, but that's B.H. Roberts' assertion. Jesus can't be wrong when quoting Isaiah. So B.H. Roberts is making a common argument that evangelical Christians would make. That is, well, Jesus read, he got up and stood up and was like, what was it? The Advent or whatever. He's like, I read you this prophecy, this day it's fulfilled, or something like that, right? And that's from Isaiah like 60 something. And so if Jesus was saying this is from the words of Isaiah, he can't be wrong about it. Okay, so one can scarcely think of Jesus being mistaken in respect of the authorship of the scripture from which he read. And we'll get more into that argument. The next argument B.H. Robert makes is Josephus tradition. He says that Josephus, which a key point to note here is Josephus was written very, very late. So about, as compared to the book of Isaiah, Josephus was written probably 100 or so years before Christ. So that's 500 years down the road from what we're talking about. But he says, Jews convinced Cyrus to let them rebuild Jerusalem by showing Cyrus Isaiah's prophecies. It was the fact that it was foreknowledge that caused Cyrus to admire the divine power thus displayed. And basically what he's saying here is that there's this Jewish tradition that the reason why Cyrus of Persia let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and escape bondage was because the Jews said, hey, we have these writings by Isaiah, and they prophesied that Cyrus, you are going to let us go back to Jerusalem. And he's like, wow, you know, and then so he sends them back to Jerusalem. So that's the argument being made here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. The last argument B.H. Robert makes is Isaiah 39 transitions well into Isaiah 40, and hence Isaiah 1 authorship describes all of 1 through 66. What he's trying to say here is that at the beginning of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah that we have today, the first chapter is kind of like an introduction, and I haven't read it actually for a long time, so I can't remember what it says specifically, but I think this is saying something like, hey, it says that this whole book is the words of Isaiah. And so that statement has to be true. And not only is that true, but the higher critics that like to separate Proto-Isaiah from Deutero-Isaiah, from chapter 39 to chapter 40, well, B.H. Robert actually thinks it flows pretty well. And so he doesn't see a real divide here. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to show you those divides here in a second, and you guys can be the judge of that for yourself. Okay. So that is basically the arguments that B.H. Roberts made against multiple scholarship of the book of Isaiah. He clung to the theory that it's one author, but he said, this is just an outline. This is worth exploring more. So I think he was very intellectually honest about that. You guys have any questions on this part?
No.
No, we're good, man.
Okay, we're going to go on. Okay, so this is a quick history of LDS apologetics and how they've dealt with this Deutero-Isaiah problem. So I'm just going to name a couple big names here. Grant Hardy, he's a BYU professor. He was probably the most honest about it, in my opinion. He says, hey, this is a huge problem, just like B.H. Roberts says. And he says, I'm not going to try to solve it. That's in his book. I can't remember the name of the book. It's in reference 3, though.
It's not Understanding the Book of Mormon, is it?
Yeah, it is Understanding the Book
Oh,
of Mormon.
okay.
Thank you. So instead, what he says is a more promising avenue for the faithful, it seems, is to acknowledge that we probably know less about what constitutes an inspired translation than we do about ancient Israel. Okay, so he's actually kind of saying, you know what, we don't really know what translation means when Joseph Smith says, I translated the Book of Mormon. So he's kind of indicating a very loose translation where Joseph Smith took the essence of what was ancient and actually happened, and then he kind of expanded from there. So the core of the Book of Mormon is historical, maybe, but the rest of it, it's kind of Joseph Smith's 19th century influence. I think that's what he's kind of hitting at there. That's kind of a Blake Ostler expansionist theory. Abraham Gileadi, who Alejandro mentioned previously. So he did some literary studies. So he analyzed the literary style of the Book of Isaiah in order to, quote unquote, he thinks he proves that it's one author and it's Isaiah. Okay. Kent Jackson, he is the writer. So there's this book called A Reason for Faith that Laura Hells presents, and she goes to a bunch of LDS scholars and BYU professors and says, hey, let's get all your best responses to the problems of stuff that's talked about in the CES letter, let's say. And that was published in 2016, right? 3 years after the CES.
She did it because of the CES letter?
That's my guess, because she addressed stuff like Kinderhook plates that is in the CS letter. that's not really thrown around too much outside. I feel like I
Yeah,
think
I've
it's
only
in
heard that
response
in the
to that.
CS letter.
I mean, in
Well,
her,
it wasn't mentioned in the CS letter, but I mean, you just
The
scratch
Kinderhook
the surface and no, the Deutero-Isaiah problem.
right, Deutero-Isaiah is not mentioned though. So
But like you dig a little deeper and you run into it.
So maybe the CS letter was an influence on her. She did say, my kids have been facing all these like stuff they read online. And so I wanted to go out and ask a bunch of the best minds in the LDS faith. And she actually did produce a very good book called A Reason for Faith. I think one of the weakest arguments made in that book, though, by the way, I read this book on my mission in the MTC, was the first time I read it. I didn't order it. A mission companion actually ordered it, and then he let me borrow it. And I was like, oh, interesting. I never read about Deutero-Isaiah or whatever. And I remember back when I read it back then, I read this argument by Kent Jackson, and it basically said, you know, the people that are talking about Deutero-Isaiah just don't believe in prophecy. They're just prophecy deniers. Okay. And so when I read that argument, I was like, oh, that's a good point. You know, who's to say Isaiah couldn't have predicted Cyrus 100 years later? And so that kind of stuck with me. And I was like, okay, this issue's fine, right? Coming back and analyzing it again and seeing that's just the tip of the iceberg. You know, this prophecy denier argument is actually does not address any of the core arguments that are being made by the higher critics or the biblical scholars. So when I say David Bokovoy debunked this in his 2-part series article on rational faith, that's what I mean by that is Kent Jackson did not actually address any of the core issues. So we're
what do you think about that now? The whole, if people don't believe in prophecy.
Yeah, so I think you can believe in prophecy and still agree that Isaiah is written by multiple authors because the evidence for that is not necessarily talking about prophecy. It's at best indirectly related with that.
What evidence?
We're going to get to it.
Okay.
Just hold on one second. Yep. Okay. So the other apologetics that the LDS faith brings is that, so I'm going to go to this bottom bullet point here. I couldn't find the source for this, but I read it in a dialogue article talking about the Book of Mormon as an expansionist thing or a midrash thing. And it basically said that, hey, Jesus, he came back and he said, hey, you guys are missing some scriptures. Let's update it. Okay. Or Moroni, maybe when he was compiling everything, he put in Isaiah into it. Okay. Because they would have had access later, right? And Jesus is all knowing, so he could put it in. So that's an argument made. I think the key point to note there is that B.H. Roberts didn't even like that argument. He didn't put it in his list of credible arguments. So that one's kind of a stretch, I think, because mainly it mentioned specifically which scripture was put back in when Jesus came. That was the prophecies of Samuel. It said nothing about Isaiah.
You think
also,
the 116 pages,
there's
Brandon?
You forgot 116 pages of the 116 pages? What do you mean?
Yeah, you think if there wasn't a plan for the 116 pages to be replaced, you think there wouldn't be a plan for Deutero-Isaiah?
I see. Well, maybe. So we'll leave that one hanging. Okay, if you want to go off that one, you can go off that one. It's an argument made by some, but I would note that most LDS apologists don't reference that as their argument. Okay. The final argument, I think, is the strongest one, is to deny multiple authorship of Isaiah, and say at the core Isaiah is written by one author, that is Isaiah. But later on, you have these scribes making errors, or they're purposely adding in their own material, and so any changes that you see or later datings of post-exilic material that you see is going to be an edit. It's not some original content. It's an edit of what was there before. Okay, so let's say Isaiah is a great prophet. He can write in prophetic terms. And then later on, the scribes say, hey, the events of the Babylonian captivity have already happened. Cyrus has already let us go back. And I'm going to write in the word Cyrus here. Okay, so that's kind of the argument there. And so,
that's interesting.
So they kind of swing around and address kind of the main scholarship there.
But in Deuteronomy, it says in Deuteronomy that you shouldn't add nor take away anything.
So that's an evangelical argument that's not even relevant to this discussion. Because if you make that argument, you're also going to probably be in the same line that says you're just denying prophecy, right? And so you're not going to be interested in this question, I would say.
But this is kind of like what we talked about with the Book of Abraham, right? That we were saying the Book of Abraham isn't really written by Abraham, and it's like these like lines passed down. So you think that there was some further scribe? You think it might have been like an oral, something like prophecy, like an oral prophecy? Maybe it was written down, and then as future generations, they started writing things down and including other things in it. Is that what that theory is mostly saying?
I mean, it's saying any of what seems to be predictive power, well, not necessarily, but anything that points to multiple authorship isn't actually multiple authorship. It's those scribes that are rewriting. They're changing it to match their own agenda and stuff like that.
Or they're just changing it to make more sense for. I think Fair Mormon says they're trying to make it make more sense, right? So like, I think the common example here is if someone's writing a story, they're looking back at an ancient story and they use the word like spear or something, but they're really just referencing a weapon. If they're going to rewrite it today, maybe they'd use something more like a pepper spray, or maybe they'll say something like a gun. So they're substituting in something completely different that's not true, but it makes more sense to them. So I think that's maybe what the Fair Mormon argument is trying to.
This isn't a Fair Mormon argument, but yeah.
I mean, this is the one that when I read Fair Mormon, that's the one that they reference.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Maybe it was then. Sorry. So I think the biggest problem that this is trying to address, though, is, well, then how did Joseph Smith? Why did he quote, exactly how it came from the King James Version 19th century Bible that Isaiah wouldn't have had, because those are later edits? And then once again, you can lean to the loose translation theory where you say, well, Joseph Smith probably had a Bible with him when he was translating. And so every time he came across this part, he just opened up his Bible that he was familiar with, copy and pasted, right? And so you can make that argument, and it's a pretty coherent argument. And I think this comment, I can't remember where I found it, by Tim Bone, is on some sort of.
Although I don't know if I can hang with that argument, because
why?
Like Oliver Cowdery said that he would just talk, right? And so the things are there word for word, right? And so we don't know a lot about how the translation happened, but I don't know. There's. But
then what do you think of this BYU study that showed that most definitely Joseph Smith had access to the that commentary? Well, I can't remember the name. The commentary on the Bible when he was writing Joseph Smith translation.
What did they say about it? I can't remember what did the BYU study say?
It said it's like 99.999% certain that he was referencing this biblical commentary when he was writing the Joseph Smith translation, and so like, even though there's no eyewitness testimony of him having any text in the translation portion, it doesn't. That
you think he went home and opposite. he would like go home and look at it, or what did the BYU?
Oh, and memorize it. That could be a possibility that would harmonize both of those.
Oh, I thought it made more sense, like the editor when he was like putting the, in the printing press when he would add.
Right, but we don't have any evidence of because we have some of the original transcripts that.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
That Skousen is looking at, and they didn't find any of that.
Yeah, if I was trying to harmonize this, then I would say that Joseph Smith, he would go home and because he studied the Bible a lot, and then he would memorize parts of Isaiah. And then when he went back to the translation process, and then he would quote from the Isaiah that he knew off the top of his head.
Yeah, that's possible.
And part of it,
but he got it really well, though.
Well, and Oliver, they talk in the scripture to Oliver Cowdery, for him to be able to do revelation. It talks about that you have to first study things out in your mind. I wonder if, maybe that was part of it, right? That you go home and you receive inspiration. What's the things that are going on? And, so I don't know. Yeah, I think I could harmonize that.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So that's part of the argument, is that's why it's such a 1-for-1 copy, almost 1-for-1. Let's say it's not perfect, but it's definitely influenced somehow, either by the King James Version 19th century Bible, what we see in Isaiah, or he's directly God is directly channeling something down him, right? You have to make one of those arguments, because they're just way too close. Read Isaiah, read 2nd Nephi 2 or whatever, compare Isaiah 12, let's say. I don't know if I got this right, but that's, so this Tim Bone guy, he's summing up this argument that of the kind of the new apologetics against it is that, hey, it's not a single author. It is a single author, but it's one that has been severely edited. And the cool thing that we don't have to worry about is that most of the very edited parts of Isaiah, let's say chapter 1, chapter 24 through 27, chapter 31, chapter 34 through 35, chapter 36 through 39, chapter 40, all of those don't actually appear in the Book of Mormon, really. And so we don't have to worry about this so much because the major problematic ones don't show up in the Book of Mormon. So that's kind of the new apologetics argument. And we'll just throw that up there. And I'm not going to deal with this directly. We're just going to keep going with the rest of the arguments, if that's okay.